So this is the microphone now, not this one, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry that I messed up the buttons over there, but we got it back in order after just a little bit of Leandro being back in the seat.
I blamed you just in case. I don't know if it was you.
We have one of the things that Leandro didn't mention in the course of the reorganization that we had that came about from the fixing of the furnace was that we also had to rearrange all the closets because you had to take everything out of the closets in order to actually access the furnace. And so that allowed us to clean the closets out for the first time since we moved in, and also clean the library out. And so that's one of the reasons why the library ended up being in a nice condition again, and we're very happy about that. So as we've, one of the things that I brought this up because I was reminded as we've been singing the 3 hymns that we have this day, how amazing a resource this hymnal is, that when we're having just about any theme that we're approaching, like for example today our theme, which is about discernment and is about, this is Transfiguration Sunday, and so our theme, as printed is, listen for the voice of God, and then it's also in commemoration of Transfiguration Sunday, which is where we are in the liturgical calendar that Community of Christ follows, which is not the same as what the Orthodox or the Catholics do. But for us, it's Transfiguration Sunday. And we'll see. This doesn't work now.
Okay. Try now.
There we are. And the Transfiguration is an event that is very, very commemorated in Christian art, I realized as I was kind of thinking about this message and pondering this message this week. The scripture comes from the Gospel of Mark. We'll read Mark 9, 2 through 9. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. This is a modern painting of the vision, and I like it that we have the 3 disciples here. And you can see Peter is thinking of these little dwelling places, these little shrines in this particular vision of it. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. This is actually a new painting as well. This is from the illuminated gospel, or the illuminated Bible that the monks in St. John's Monastery and St. John's University in Minnesota, which is very close to where I grew up, was. And this is the first time that Christians have created an entire illuminated manuscript since the printing press, essentially. And it's just a magnificently illuminated volume. Anyway, so and they were only Jesus, and as they were coming down from the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. This is the image on one of the cathedrals, medieval cathedrals in above a door in Europe. So the Transfiguration then is our story from the Gospels here. Mark, which we just read, is actually our source for this story. The story is also in Luke and Matthew, but Luke and Matthew took their versions from Mark and then retold the story, edited it, and expanded it. Unlike all of the other gospel stories, this one is different in that this is something that occurs and happens to Jesus as opposed to something that Jesus is doing on behalf of someone. So normally in the miraculous stories that we read in the gospel accounts, it is someone else who's being served or transformed, the healing miracles especially. In this case, we're having something quite different. some scholars, as they've looked at it, it's possible that this narrative may actually have originally been free-floating as a story that people told, early Christians told, of a vision of the risen Christ, so as opposed to where we have it in Mark's narrative. And one of the reasons for that is that Mark, in crafting his particular story, believed that Christ had not yet returned. And so in the ending of Mark's story, it ends kind of abruptly with the women at the tomb, and essentially they're told, don't tell anybody what you've seen. And the idea that Mark had, as he's writing, right after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem around the year 70, he really believed that a second coming, a literal second coming, would happen within a couple of years. And so part of his idea then is that in his gospel, he tells no stories then that we have in the other gospels. For example, the story of Pentecost, where Christ is among the disciples afterwards, or any of the other visions of Jesus that the disciples had. And instead, like I say, Mark's story kind of ends abruptly, and instead it may well be that those stories, Mark believed, didn't occur after Jesus' resurrection, but rather occurred before Jesus' crucifixion. Because again, he believes that that Jesus hasn't come back yet, and that there'll be a second coming. So this is part of the idea that we have among the early Christians. They understand the story to be differently from each other. And one of the wonderful things that we have in having multiple gospel accounts is that those different variations and there's different understandings, we're able to compare them and see how early Christians were thinking differently. And that's one of the things we'll talk about on Tuesday in the theology lecture. Anyway, Mark did know stories about apostles having visions of Christ, and like I say, that may have been read back into it for this particular vision of Transfiguration. Also, for example, the story of Jesus walking on water, that may have been a vision that people had after the resurrection of they now have encountered the risen Christ. So it doesn't particularly matter which is the case as far as Mark's concerned, because of Mark's also has this theology of the messianic secret. So as we read through Mark's accounts, and as we read today in this particular story, every time something happens where people understand that Jesus is the Messiah, or are coming to understand that, Jesus will instruct them not to tell anyone. And that happens in Mark's gospel. And so, for example, in this case, with the idea that the people who have the vision in Mark's account, Peter, James, and John, they're told that they're not to talk about it until after the resurrection anyway. So for everyone else, they would have heard about it at the same time, regardless of when this vision happened, before or after. And so what I want to do today is not examine this vision from the lens of a historian. Instead, I want to talk about it Christologically. I want to talk about it theologically, and how it has been important in our understanding of Christ from that standpoint, Christologically. So theologians often mark out 5 major milestones or markers in understanding Christ as God among early Christians in the gospel accounts. And so there, in these 5, we have lozenges or whatever. The Transfiguration is almost always portrayed this way, in this kind of shape. So the first being the baptism, and this again is one of those moments of a theophany where when Jesus is baptized in the gospel account, there is also a voice from the heavens, and there is also the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, in the form of a dove, right? So these are when we understand again the concept, the emerging concept that the early evangelists and prophets are having, Christian prophets, of the Trinity, the triune God. The baptism, the transfiguration, which is our topic today, the crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension. So as I mentioned, this is one of the very, very highly illustrated moments in the gospel stories. And so we have on our wall the stained glass windows from Chartres, and that includes one of these little, I've blown it up here so you can see it. That includes one of the little episodes or vignettes that is the Transfiguration, and you can see Christ in the middle, flanked by Moses and Elijah, Peter, James, and John. And the idea here is that this is a moment, this technical term, theophany, or God, the appearance of God. So as humans encounter the divine, these are moments that we call theophany. And so here again, these are those triads. So Christ, Moses, Elijah, Peter, James, and John, two triads that are woven into the iconography, woven into this particular story. So Mark, when he's talking about the people who are experiencing this vision, he singles out these particular three apostles. So Peter, originally named Simon, son of Jonah; James, there's a lot of Jameses in the Bible, so which James? This particular James is sometimes called James the Greater. So this is the James from Santiago de Compostela in Spain, so that St. Iago. St. Jacob is called James the Greater. He's the son of Zebedee as far as he's identified in the Bible. And then his brother, John, is also son of Zebedee, is John the Beloved. And so the idea is that John is, by tradition, the youngest of the apostles, and Peter is sort of the leader, and the James is the first to be martyred. Previously, in Mark's narrative, he had singled out this group as that they are brought alone when Jesus raises the daughter of Jairus. So that's one other time that they had already been singled out and brought separately from the other disciples. And they're also going to have one more episode where they are brought apart, and that is at this important moment in Gethsemane when Jesus is praying prior to, in the events of Holy Week, prior to the crucifixion. So the three of them are brought apart, and then they, of course, fall asleep while Jesus is praying. And of course, this same grouping of apostles then becomes important in our restoration tradition. And so in the shared vision recounted later by Oliver Cowdery and Joseph Smith, the appearance of these three, Peter, James, and John, is part of how they understood priesthood to be restored in the 19th century in our tradition. The divine triad that we have here are Moses, Elijah, and Christ. Moses, of course, being the lawgiver, known traditionally to early Christians and Jews as the author of the Torah, so the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, although scholars don't say that now, but anyway, that's symbolically how he's understood. And so therefore, in this vision representing then the law or Torah, he himself had experienced a theophany, a very famous one, obviously, where he is standing before the burning bush on Mount Sinai, which in some ways the Transfiguration itself, going up on this mountain, is a recapitulation of that. So in the same way that Moses had gone on Sinai and experienced the presence of God and seen a vision in the form of a burning bush, now Peter, James, and John are having that same experience, and Moses is present. And the fact that the Old Testament leaves Moses' sort of death a mystery, it says that he died when he's 120, but it says that no one knows where his grave is. That had led to a bunch of speculation that Second Temple Jews and early Christians had, and actually people in the Restoration tradition as well, that perhaps Moses had not died, but in fact had been taken up by God. That's certainly also true in the tradition for Elijah, who is one of the greatest prophets of the Old Testament, and in this case is thought by early Christians in this vision to represent the prophets. And you may remember that the Hebrew Bible, as understood by early Christians, as understood by Second Temple Jews, is divided into Torah, the law, and the 5 books, and the prophets. So the law, the prophets, and the writings. And so in this case, maybe then by Christ being between Moses and Elijah, the vision here is Christ among the Bible itself, represented as the Bible. Elijah also experienced a theophany, and if you might remember that this is this wonderful evocative passage where God isn't in the thunder in all these different places, these boom and wonder that Elijah experiences, but he finally experiences God in the still small voice. And also in this case, in the biblical account, Elijah is taken up in the whirlwind, and so that he is not having a regular mortal death, but is taken by God. And so one of the expectations then that Second Temple Jews had, including early Christians like Mark, was that Elijah would come again, and that would presage the coming kingdom, which they expected to be, in many cases, they expected to be quite a literal thing, and to be, like I say in Mark's case, he really expected it was going to be 2 or 3 years from his present when he was writing. And so in some cases, the early Christian theology was that the person who is the Elijah come again is possibly John the Baptist, who is a forerunner of Jesus, or it's also possible that he will come again as we understood it, for example, in the Restoration tradition. There's a vision of Elijah in the Kirtland Temple, and that this is meant to be, in other words, because they also believed in a literal second coming and they thought it would be quite imminent, they also saw it from that way based on those prophecies. So, in the symbolism of this vision then, Christians here have seen Jesus Christ as the fulfillment of the law and the prophets, the Old Testament, so the law and the prophets. And the vision also includes a voice from the clouds, who is the unseen, representing the Creator, although by the time you get to the Renaissance, they actually take unseen and actually paint a picture of him. So this is something that you weren't allowed to do in Judaism, and you weren't supposed to do in early Christianity all the way up through the later Middle Ages, and especially the Renaissance, when in the Renaissance they started making paintings of God the Creator, God the Father for the first time. And so in this case, he is essentially like an emperor or pope, as how the early 15th century people are envisioning him. Anyway, an unseen creator in the vision, a voice from the cloud who says, "This is my son, the beloved, listen to him." And of course, that same phrasing is very similar to the theophany that we'd already talked about, that Mark describes with the baptism of Jesus. And so that from Mark chapter 1, 9 through 11, we read, "And when he came up out of the water, when Jesus came up out of the water, immediately he saw the heavens being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, 'You are my beloved Son. With you I am well pleased.'" So again, the theophany. And of course, in his final account, as he was recalling his own childhood visionary experience, Joseph Smith used the same words to describe the voice of the Creator in his theophany in the grove in Palmyra, the Creator's voice being, "This is my beloved Son, hear him." So the same voice. So through this whole sermon, I relied very heavily on this artwork because there is so much amazing artwork as this vision has inspired Christians throughout the millennia. As a people of the book, much of our religious practice is about intellect. And so it's often about reading the text, it's about studying text, it's about teaching and preaching words. And for example, as a result of our tradition, in the Protestant Reformation, one of the core things that the reformers did was they purged Christian tradition of any kind of ritual elements, anything that smacked of what they thought was paganism, right? And so essentially they whitewashed all of the artwork, and covered it all up if possible. And certainly any gaudy artwork, they had to go and be taken down, any statuary. And they also took, for example, the altars out of the front of the churches and instead put pulpits in the front of the churches. And instead of having the sacramental ritual be the center of Christian worship, the sermon became the central ritual. And here the pulpit still is, in our tradition, and here the sermon is still, and the spoken word is still the focus of our tradition as a result of those changes in the Reformation. But what I want to kind of say is here that as we recount the vision of the Transfiguration and as we think about these other theophanies, so these are pictures that we have here at Center Place in the hallway We maybe every once in a while will ponder, so it's paintings here of Sinai or pictures on canvas of Sinai, of Galilee, of Palmyra, representing the theophanies of the Old Covenant, the New Covenant, the restored covenant. So the idea here is Moses before the burning bush, the disciples being chosen by Jesus at the shore of the Sea of Galilee, Joseph Smith's prayer to have his sins forgiven in the grove. That we can't just have our spiritual practice be entirely about the head and feeding the head. Ongoing spiritual transformation requires us to engage in practices that feed the soul as well. So one part of the call is then for us to take time to appreciate, think about, ponder artwork. And we certainly have tried to do that here as we've added thoughtful paintings and thoughtful illumination throughout our particular building. Another way that we do it is by singing together. And so I mentioned how much I really treasure this particular resource. I like it. I listen to the words a lot. Landra just listens to the songs. And we have different ways that we approach it, which is fine. That's another way that we are able to have an inward and feed the heart and soul, not just the mind. And another way that we can experience our own inward theophany is through practices such as prayer and meditation, as much as what other things that we do, like sermons and lectures and studying and reading. And I think it's been a wonderful innovation that we have here in Center Place, is that after the sermon, we now move to meditating on the message, and that's what we are about to do. So as I conclude then, I would like to think about how are we feeding our souls as much as feeding the mind.